Now friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. Today we're going to take a look at one of the most controversial figures in the wizarding world, Tom Riddle, otherwise known by his stripper name, Voldemort. Oftentimes, history is written and muddled by the victors, especially after long periods of conflict, drama, and strife. The First and Second Wizarding Wars between the Death Eaters and their foes caused massive amounts of death and fear amongst the magical community. Very few wizards and witches were left unscathed by the events of these two conflicts. When Harry Potter and his allies emerged from the Second Wizarding War after finally defeating Voldemort, they also won the right to reshape how history would be told for the following generations. Voldemort and his Death Eaters were painted as magical supremacists, murderers, and generally scum of the earth, whereas the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army were heralded as heroes. It was a very black and white portrayal of this conflict that wasn't without its fair share of truth. But it also was a portrayal that was heavily blinded by emotion and inherent bias by those who were deeply affected by the conflict, which ultimately prevents us from accurately seeing what actually happened. Now, we've all heard of Harry Potter's side of the story. There are several books written by a pro-Potter propagandist and a film series based on those books, along with a Broadway play and spin-off series. But what about Voldemort's story? What was the reasoning behind this man's actions, and was he truly an irredeemably evil wizard? It's never great to assume historical figures' intentions, especially if you've never met them or have done the adequate research to truly understand what their motives are. Although Voldemort was universally feared by the wizarding community, very few people actually truly understood what kind of person he was and what motivated him. That fear only compounded the misunderstanding and mystery surrounding this individual. You see, Tom Riddle was the result of a lie. His mother, Merope Gaunt, a pure-blood witch from the infamous Gaunt wizarding family, had bewitched a local nobleman by the name of Tom Riddle with a love potion. The two lived together for almost a year, and Merope became pregnant. But she became tired of living this lie and soon lifted her spell from Tom Riddle. Not surprisingly, this led to Tom Riddle Sr. leaving his wife and unborn child. Merope was obviously very upset, became depressed, and gave up practicing magic completely. She would ultimately die giving birth to Tom Riddle, aka Voldemort. Tom was raised in a Muggle-run orphanage and from an early age showed some troubling signs of antisocial behavior, including constantly challenging authority, torturing animals, and bullying the other orphans. It was said that Tom even suffered from spells of psychosis. Now, perhaps if his mother and Tom Riddle Sr. had stayed together, things would have turned out differently. Maybe all Tom Riddle needed was a loving family around him to raise him and guide him. Or perhaps Tom Riddle had way too much Gaunt DNA in him. The Gaunt family were known for being a very magically supremacist family, obsessed with blood purity, which naturally led to a lot of inbreeding, which led to some pretty messed up children. Anyway, the point is, whether it's Voldemort's genetics or upbringing, he was basically guided down a very narrow and dark path from a very early age. As a young boy in Hogwarts, Tom Riddle proved to be extremely intelligent, brave, and charismatic. He was the model student, even became the head boy, a position only assigned to the most trusted students. But beneath this facade, he was an individual who was obsessed with his own identity, finding immortality, and ultimately gaining as much power as possible. Growing up without a family, Tom Riddle was extremely resentful of his Muggle father, who he felt put him in his current situation. He eventually ends up murdering his father and his entire immediate family, and was responsible for attacks on Muggle-born students in Hogwarts, which he blamed on the half-giant Hagrid. Now, if we are being emotional, we could condemn Tom Riddle for being an evil little bastard. But if we take a deeper look at his actions and what motivated them, there are some undeniable truths. The wizarding world has constantly been at odds with the normal world, and despite the best intentions of people on both sides of the magical divide, history has shown that these two groups are ultimately incompatible. Fear, bigotry, and hysteria seems to always drown out calmer voices calling for reconciliation and cooperation. The International Statute for Wizard Secrecy was established for this very reason. And after centuries of persecution of wizards and witches all across Europe by religious institutions and witch hunting organizations, the once mutually beneficial relationship between the magical and non-magical was destroyed somewhere around the 15th century. The non-magical had greatly benefited from magic in the old days. At the time, wizards and witches were far more advanced than normal society's technology and able to cure many ailments and medical issues that were otherwise incurable. But as oftentimes happens with humans, fear accompanies what is unknown, and soon anything that had to do with magic became associated with the occult and evil. And after centuries of violence against witchcraft, the Ministry of Magic of Great Britain attempted to gain recognition and protection from the British monarchy, but ultimately failed to achieve what they set out to do. Facing genocide and destruction, the Wizards of Great Britain gathered together at the Wizengamot, which was Britain's high court of law for magical people. One more militant faction supported an all-out war against the non-magical people of Earth, whereas the more pacifist faction supported a withdrawal from non-magical society. Now, the latter faction won, and in 1689, the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy was established and 3 years later put into action all across the planet. The statute enacted a lengthy guide to help preserve the wizarding community and keep it out of sight of the non-magical community. This included hiding the magical infrastructure of each nation in plain sight with an assortment of spells and charms. And so, at least for a certain period of time, order was restored and the magical community could once again flourish without the fear of persecution. Now, as we mentioned before, magic at the time far surpassed anything that humans had available. But as the decades turned into centuries and man entered the atomic age and then the computer and information age, the gap in between magic and human technology began to decrease. Arguably, by the time of the Second Wizarding War, the magical community had already been surpassed by non-magical society. Witches and wizards still relied on owls for sending messages and packages and lacked an information storage and communications platform as robust as a computer and its connection to the internet. Many wizards became increasingly alarmed by humanity's exponentially growing technological capabilities. The firearm had come a long way from early muskets and was now easily as deadly as a killing curse, and that was just the beginning of humanity's destructive ingenuity. It now seemed possible that scientists might uncover how magic works at its very basic level, thanks to theoretical scientific research that was now questioning the fundamental building blocks of what made our universe tick. Those who were well tuned with the wider world outside of the well-insulated magical community began realizing just how perilous their situation was. Voldemort was one of these individuals, and ultimately he started the First Wizarding War. He had many goals in mind, but the most important ones were purging the magical community of impure wizards with Muggle blood and leading a wizard revolution over the Muggle world. In order to achieve dominance over the Muggle world, it was imperative that he unite the wizarding community first by getting rid of anyone who might oppose him. And so Voldemort used his intelligence, charisma, and courage to lead a war against the Ministry of Magic and the establishment. He recruited giants and other magical creatures that had been banished by the magical community and called upon many of the pure-blood wizarding houses to support his movement. But even had Voldemort been successful, it's very unclear if the wizarding community had what it took to actually overcome the non-magical world. Across the entire planet, there were perhaps at best a few million witches and wizards. They were clearly outnumbered by non-magical people. And as we said, human technology was quickly gaining on magic. But Voldemort realized that if humanity were to eventually figure out how magic works, the rediscovery of the wizarding community would be imminent, and at that point the fate of the magical community would be taken out of the hands of wizards and witches and put into the hands of Muggle leaders. This was unacceptable for Voldemort, and for good reason, and he was willing to do whatever it took, even if that meant killing people, to assure the safety of the wizarding community. There are already theories circulating in the scientific community that magic might exist and could be detected in the electromagnetic spectrum. And Voldemort feared that with each passing year, the magic community grew weaker as the non-magical community grew stronger. It's not to say that Voldemort was right, or to excuse his murderous behavior and general unpleasantness, but I think it's important to study the motives behind such a man. After all, a large percentage of the wizarding community followed him during the Wizarding Wars. These were wizards and witches from all walks of life. Some were criminals and murderers, but others were just normal individuals trying to protect the future of their way of life. And as a non-magical individual myself, I think it's very important to closely study potential enemies. And in order to do so, you have to cast away caricatures that are very emotional and biased, and also try to strip away your own inherent bias on any subject. One almost needs to be scientific in their pursuit of understanding to become enlightened to the truth. And once you understand someone to their entirety, you'll understand how best to deal with them, and if necessary, defeat them. So this video was ultimately not about whether Voldemort is good or evil, but whether he was right to start a war against the Muggles, or a non-magical community. And I think in this case, from the wizarding perspective, he was right, because they were going to have to make a last stand eventually, and the sooner they did, the better chance they would have to overcome us. And ultimately, I think that Harry Potter and Dumbledore's kind of view of coexisting with the Muggle world is a bit naive, and most likely will lead to the magical world's destruction in the near future. Well guys, let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie and you are the protagonist.